Welcome back everyone, it is Eric from Ray Candy, and today we finally have the full set reveal for Ruler of the Black Flame. So of course this is going to be Japan's latest set that they're going to be getting, about a week from the time of recording this video, but also of course this is going to be sort of the main component of what will become our Obsidian Flames set, which also isn't really that far out either at this point. So we finally should have a good idea of what we're going to be getting in our international set based on these reveals today. But I'd say sort of the big new gimmicks to this set is that we have the return of baby Pokemon after a little bit of a hiatus, as well as I'd say some more interesting takes on the whole Tera Pokemon mechanic, which I think a lot of people up until now have sort of been let down by. But with that being said, guys, I'm going to stop rambling. Just remember to smack that like button for me, feed that always hungry YouTube algorithm, and let's jump in and check out what we're getting in this new Ruler of the Black Flame set. So it looks like we have a new Bellossom here, and I think this card actually did get revealed a couple days before this video is being posted. But it has powerful dance. You flip a coin for every energy attached to this Pokemon. It does 90 for each heads. I don't think this is going to be too great. This is a stage 2 Pokemon with sort of a gimmicky coin flip attack. We don't have Glimwood Tangle. We don't really have any ways at, manipulating our coin flips. But of course, if you are just here for the memes when it comes to Bellossom, you always can pair this with Cherrim and just throw down like a million energy. Reversal energy also does work with this thing, so one attachment of those will provide an additional 3. But honestly, guys, I think if you want to play something like this, I would just play the Ambipom from Pokemon Go. It's a stage 1. I know it does hit for a little bit less damage, but it also does have a really good ability that can sometimes allow you to not get knocked out. Okay, we got a new Trevenant, and its art's actually pretty nice. I do like the way this card looks. But let's see, has an ability. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, put 1 damage counter on your opponent's active during Pokemon checkup. Okay, so basically 1 damage counter between every turn. So it's kind of like Shrine of Punishment built into a stage 1 here. My issue for this card, I think I have though, is that because it has a free retreat, or not free retreat, it has a 3 retreat, and we don't really have anything like Floatstone or Air Balloon that can allow this card to move easily out of the active. I think that means we have to use this as like an attacker. But my issue is that the attack isn't really good enough to build around. Like if this card had, let's say, a 1 retreat cost and we could pair this with Beach Court, well, we could play maybe like a thin line of Trevenant. That way, every time between knockouts, we can promote Trevenant and allow some damage counters to rack up on our opponent. That could be cool. But because we don't have anything to sort of make that happen, we have to go all in on this attack, and it's just not good enough. Even with something like Choice Belt or Defiance Band, we're maxing out at 130, which doesn't feel that great. Like, I know we could play that plus, was it Practice Studio? That increases the damage of stage 1s by 10. So you can do that, and that does sort of, well, I guess technically you don't need the stadium because this does the extra damage counter for you, so there's that. So I guess your stadium is a little bit more flexible, but I still think this is a lot of hoops to jump through for a card that's just largely kind of underwhelming. You also do have to figure out a way to power this thing up. Obviously, reversal energy is an option, but you probably do also have to play something like Cherrim to be able to keep chaining these attacks turn after turn. So pretty good ability. I do like the ability, but just the rest of the card sort of drags it down overall. Okay, we have Scovillain here. See, this one also does have an ability. So this Pokemon is both grass and fire. Okay, so that's not an awful ability. Then the attack is just 110. So this really strikes me as the type of card that is like sort of asking to be played in something like Zoroark Toolbox, just because it is sort of just by nature a toolboxy sort of card. But I think in the case of Zoroark Toolbox, I don't think this actually makes a good case for itself, because there's definitely just better grass attackers. There's Spidops, which I think is probably maybe even the best grass one right now. There's also, I think actually another Scovillain is pretty decent if I remember right. But of course the big upside to this one is that, you are part fire, but even still, I don't think that makes enough of a case for this card. I think if this card would see play, this would be like if there's a different Scovillain deck that already exists. I think this gets slotted in as a one of, just to maybe help against maybe a potentially popular fire weak Pokemon that might emerge at some point. Okay, so we have Ninetales. I don't think this card was previously revealed. So let's see. Nine-tailed Dance. Put 9 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. During next turn, this Pokemon can't attack. That's pretty bad. Like, even if it didn't have this part of the attack and you could still use it again, I still don't think this would be that great. So kind of mystifying card design that we have here, but not a huge fan of this Ninetales. Okay, we have a new Entei, and this artwork is really cool. I'm actually not super familiar with this artist. I don't know if this is a newer one for the Pokemon TCG, but I really like this sort of kind of like watercolor look that we have to Entei here. Looks pretty nice, gotta say. But Entei's ability says, as long as this Pokemon is your active, your opponent's active's attacks do 20 less damage. Well, doesn't matter too much when you only have 130 HP. Like, I guess you can play, what is it? Not Cape of Toughness, but Bravery Charm to get 50 extra HP, 20 reduction. You could throw down like Radiant Gardevoir or something like that as well. So there's like ways to sort of double down on this, but honestly, I think a lot of the time this is a pretty pointless ability. So yeah, not crazy about this part of the card. It may as well be blank as far as I can tell. But let's see, Blaze Ball, 50 plus 20 for each fire energy attached to this Pokemon. So I don't think this is that great either, because Magma Basin is probably just too slow to get this thing going. Well, I guess we do have the new Charizard EX. So every time you evolve into one of those, you can get 3 energies. So this might, in theory, be a 1 prize Pokemon to play with Charizard. Since it's basic, you can just slap it down. So that doesn't seem awful to me, guys, but I'm curious if this is even the best like basic fire Pokemon to like go that strategy with. But it's not a completely awful card, but just nothing special though either. So we have Ice Cube EX. Like I said, guys, the Tera Pokemon do become a little bit more interesting with this set. You know, up until now, we've only seen Tera Pokemon be featured as their normal type, but now we have ones that are venturing outside of their traditional typing. Of course, Ice Cube is going to be an example here. Instead of being a water type, it's going to be a fire type, but it does still require its like normal energy to get up and going, which is interesting. I don't mind that, because I think in theory, like if you are, let's say like a Bax Caliber deck, just as an example, it is kind of cool that you can play another Pokemon that still uses all of the same energy that you normally would need, but now you can give yourself better type coverage. So I think that is kind of cool. I'm not sure how many of these Pokemon we're going to look at today actually get those sorts of cool interactions, but the theory is there. That's, I think, the allure to these weird typed Pokemon. Ice Cube EX here. Let's take a look at this guy specifically. Of course, still has the same Tera Pokemon rule, prevents bench damage against it, but this guy for 3 water does 160. You discard energy from this Pokemon, and the defending Pokemon can't attack during your opponent's next turn. So, I mean, I guess the theory for this card is that, you know, 160, you're probably just two-shotting your opponent no matter what. So you can do this, make it to where your opponent can't attack, and then you sort of get to freely hit into them again on the next turn and like effectively one-shot them. I think that's sort of the idea. But my issue I think I have is that Chien-Pao EX and Bax Caliber, like that whole archetype can already just take one-shots on anything already. So why not just play your Chien-Paos instead? You already want to play them in your deck. Chien-Pao just sort of does a better job of this whole strategy that I'm sort of outlining here. And honestly, I don't really think the fire typing gives it any benefit either, because like, even though Chien-Pao is weak to metal and fire can of course one-shot metal Pokemon, the issue still is that Chien-Pao can still just one-shot metal Pokemon even if it's weak to it. So again, I like the theory behind these weirdly typed Tera Pokemon, but I just don't see the big reason to play this guy specifically. So next we have Sharpedo here, and Sharpedo has a pretty familiar attack. Does 10 plus 30 for each energy in your opponent's retreat cost. So really, since I think the end of the Sun and Moon era, we've seen just a nice stream of these styles of attacks ever since, but none of them have really been great. Like the last ones that were actually pretty playable were the Tangrowth, as well as my Milotic V only a few sets later. But after that, we really haven't had many of these styles of attacks be successful. And I definitely think now, where we don't have Galar Mine in the format, we don't have like the old Absol from Team Up to increase their retreat cost, it's just harder than ever to really make these styles of attacks do like a substantive amount of damage. So I don't think that Sharpedo really has the tools right now to buff this attack up high enough to warrant playing it right now. Okay, it looks like we have a Seismitoad with a kind of annoying ability, but a kind of cute artwork. It looks like he's protecting this flower from all the rain, so very wholesome artwork that we have here. But Seismitoad has the Quaking Area ability. As long as this guy is in the active spot, your opponent's actives attacks cost 1 more energy. So that's actually like not too bad, just in a vacuum. In practice, I don't know how good this is actually going to be. And then the attack does 120, and then during your next turn does 100 more. But I think my issue with this attack is that it's only a single prize Pokemon, which means, like, yes, in theory, you can just keep attacking every turn doing a nice steady 220, but you really just don't have the HP to pull off this style of strategy because, you know, even if you go against like an Arceus deck, which is one of the like more moderate hitting Pokemon that's popular right now in the game, they're still knocking you out doing 180. And at that point, every time you're setting up a Seismitoad, you're just doing 120 over and over at that point. So I think this is really just the wrong attack printed on this Pokemon, but the ability is pretty good. This is going to be annoying against a few different decks in the format, though there are going to be certain Pokemon like Gardevoir decks that just sort of laugh at you if you ever send this thing up, since they can easily accelerate beyond what their normal attack cost is. So Seismitoad kind of seems like it's just striking out overall here. Okay, we have what actually looks like kind of an interesting Cryogonal or Cryogonal. Not sure, but either way, has this attack for 1 colorless energy, does 30. And if you go second and it's your first turn, your opponent's active is now paralyzed. So I actually think this damage is almost a little bit irrelevant, but what makes this card interesting is that it's a level ball searchable, colorless attacking Pokemon that can auto paralyze your opponent. And I think the theory here is, well, if you lose the coin flip, you know, your opponent has that first turn advantage of being able to get set up. But on your first turn, now you can maybe paralyze your opponent's active and set them back a turn to, you know, nullify that first turn advantage they would get. Now, there's definitely some downsides to this. I think a lot of decks don't really care about this effect because decks like Lost Box play like a million switching cards. Other decks are going to be like evolution decks like Arceus or even Gardevoir. But I do think there are certain decks, maybe like in the case of Chien-Pao or like a Miraidon deck, where your opponent probably isn't going to evolve out of this effect. I could see this actually being kind of big in those sorts of matchups. So maybe could be like a one-of card to sort of watch out for at some point. Okay, we have Palafin here, which is a card we've already seen, you know, like a month or two ago. I think this card overall is pretty average. Jet Punch just does its normal 30 and 30 snipe, and then Justice Kick does 210. Only if it came from the bench to the active spot, that's fine. But really, I don't see what deck we're putting this in. Like if we're playing Baxcalibur or like Palkia or anything with some water energy acceleration, I don't see the incentive to play Palafin. I mean, unless you're like a water deck that just gets shut down by like Mimikyu or something like that, I just don't see the reason to play this card. But that being said, even though Palafin is kind of meh, was it Finizen? Yeah, Finizen here is actually pretty good. I do like this card. You switch this with one of your bench Pokemon, then search your deck for a card that evolves from this Pokemon and evolve it. So if we get like a Palafin EX or just a better regular Palafin, we can just instantly evolve into it and switch to the bench. And I think that part in particular is really good because with a lot of these Ascension style attacks we've seen, even though on paper they seem cool, a lot of the time you're just evolving and your opponent knocks out what's in the active spot. So this is great that we not only get to evolve quicker, but we also get to switch that Pokemon out of harm's way until we're ready to attack on our next turn. Okay, so we have a Tera Tyranitar EX. This was one of the first cards we saw get revealed from this set. So I imagine a lot of you guys are pretty familiar with it, but let's just take a look at this card if you need a refresher. Of course, has the Tera effect here, but has Mountain Crumble, does 120, and you discard the top 2 cards of your deck. And then Toll Rampage does 150 plus 100 if any of your bench Pokemon have damage counters on them. I feel like I'm kind of close to liking this card, but not quite there. Like, I really wish this first attack milled the top 2 of your opponent's deck, because 120, it's a decent number. It's not two-shotting a lot of things in the format though. Like unless you have a choice belt on this card or like a Defiance band, you're not two-shotting Pokemon V-Star, definitely not two-shotting Pokemon V-Max. So I just feel like as a consolation prize, we should be discarding the top 2 cards of our opponent's deck. But luckily, the second attack is a little bit more heavy hitting, especially against these Pokemon V-Star decks. This actually hits for some really good numbers because with the Choice Belt, we are actually one-shotting things like Arceus. Of course, we're probably just already one-shotting Lugia and Palkia since they're weak to lightning anyway, so that's actually kind of good there. And really, I'm not even too worried about this bench damage part of the attack because you can just play something like Gengar, get it out of discard, put it on your bench, and immediately have damage counters ready to go. So that seems easy. And the second energy cost, I also don't think it's that big of a deal. We do have Gutsy Pickaxe that will work even on non-fighting Pokemon. But there's even still stuff like Raihan as well. So I don't think this attack is actually that clunky. I don't know. Like, if we're playing this, I feel like Hisuian Zoroark V-Star already kind of does something similar. So maybe we should just play that since it's not a stage 2. I don't know, but this guy also has 340 HP, whereas Zoroark is a little bit more fragile. So I don't know, maybe Tyranitar is a little bit better than Zoroark. I'm not sure. This card overall I think is just kind of okay. I think if it is going to see any play, it's just going to be because it's sort of coasting by on its good typing. I think that's really the only thing helping it right now. But if nothing else, I will say I do like this better than Ice-Q EX. So we do have a new Thundurus, and this guy says, as long as it's your active, prevent all damage done to your bench Pokemon by your opponent's attacks. And then its only attack for 2 lightning does 140 and does 90 to itself. This card's like almost interesting. I think the attack really does make it a good bit worse, but the reason I am like kind of partial to this card is that I think had this attack not said this could have in theory been a decent Pokemon for Miraidon decks to use, because Lost Box I think is going to be one of Miraidon's worst matchups just because you're playing these relatively low HP multi-prize Pokemon that are susceptible to all of the sniping effects of things like Radiant Greninja, most notably, Sableye, etc. But I think the theory would have been, against Lost Box, you just lead with Thundurus and just keep trying to take knockouts with this guy on the turns that your opponent might be threatening like a Radiant Greninja attack. I mean, that's the theory. Outside of that, I honestly don't really have that much good to say about this card, but the attack here just sort of takes that away, because even if you're disrupting that play and they don't have an escape rope for some reason to get around this, well, you're still just setting up damage for them to maybe do some Sableye shenanigans to your Thundurus. All right, so we have a Belly Bolt with an interesting ability. It says you prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by the attacks of your opponent's lightning Pokemon. So I guess if you ever go against something like Miraidon, I mean, this just sort of shuts them out of the game at that point. I guess that's cool, though. I don't know who is going to be teching a stage 1 into their deck to deal with Miraidon. So next up, as you can see, we have our first baby Pokemon of all of these new cards. And it looks like they are sort of adopting the Sun and Moon era baby Pokemon design philosophy. They all have free retreat cost, 30 HP, and usually just a 0 energy attack, which I think is kind of interesting. I really do wish we would go back to like the old like Neo era, or even I think the e-reader era baby Pokemon, where they could still evolve into, you know, like Clefairy, Clefable, etc. So that's something I do wish would come back, even though even in the past, those sorts of things didn't wind up being that relevant. I just think it doesn't really make sense why I can't evolve Cleffa into a Clefairy. It just seems dumb. So wish they would have done that, but let's look at this actual Cleffa. This one says draw cards until you have 7 cards in your hand. So Cleffa has a long history in the game of drawing players cards. I actually think some of the old Cleffas are some of the best like support Pokemon of all time, if we're being honest. So this one is attempting, I think, to live up to that sort of legacy, but I'm not that convinced of this card, if I'm being honest. Because yes, you can just hard retreat into a Cleffa and use this ability, or not ability, but this attack to refresh your hand a little bit. But we are now in a format where most decks outside of like Lost Box are going to be playing Iono. So there's a good chance even after you refill your hand to 7, it's just going to get reset down to 6. Now, I guess you could make the argument that if you needed to refresh your hand anyways, even an Iono could still theoretically help you out at that point. 30 HP is also pretty bad in this day and age, of course, with Lost Box decks running around, being able to gust around Cleffa until they're ready to pick this thing off with Sableye. They can use Echoing Horn to get this thing back into play, pick it off for an easy knockout as well. So even though they do have easy to use attacks, they have free retreat cost, I don't think these cards are being released into sort of the right meta right now. So if things do shift and we do have a way to maybe keep Lost Box decks in check, I think maybe there is a world where these cards could return. But for the moment, I think these baby Pokemon cards are largely somewhat unplayable, even if Cleffa here does have a kind of decent attack. Okay, so we have a Togekiss with kind of a cool ability here. It says once during your turn, you can draw cards until you have 8 cards in your hand. So I'm definitely on board with having an effect like this where after your turn, you get to refill your hand. But I think my big issue with this card is that it's after your turn. I really wish this was after your opponent's, because even if you are doing this, your opponent can just Iono you. So the whole reason you would want to play a card like this is just sort of nullified by the existence of cards like Judge or Iono. If we're not playing this for the ability, I don't think we're playing this for the attack. It's kind of weak. Like, I know we can power this up with Reversal Energy or Double Turbo, but as a stage 2 Pokemon, doing 110 is just not enough. Don't really see the reason to play this card. Okay, so there is a new Lunatone that I guess theoretically you could play in the Solrock Lunatone deck. So this thing says if you have any Solrock in play, prevent all effects of your opponent's stadium cards done to your Pokemon. So honestly, I don't think there's too many stadium cards that you're really worried about as the Solrock Lunatone player. But there is a couple of stadiums. There's like the one that increases what your retreat costs, I think, if you're a non-fighting Pokemon. There's the new one, I think, that we're actually going to look at in this set that will increase the attack cost of basic Pokemon, but with your energy acceleration, you can just get around that. So these are the types of effects this guy can combat against, but I just don't think there's too many that you're really worried about. Well, maybe if this protects against Lost City, maybe that could be good. But also, I think maybe just playing additional counter stadiums. Like, you already want to play Pokestop more than likely in your Solrock Lunatone deck anyways. So maybe just keeping that maxed out is going to be good enough. But I guess the theory is this is level ball searchable, or just searchable in general, whereas a stadium card is going to be more difficult to find. So this maybe could be a one of in that deck if it ever becomes a thing again. So we have a Holo Claydol. Claydol does have one attack here. It's kind of cool. So Kaboom Doll, you knock this guy out, or well, it takes 120 damage to be specific. But then you put damage counters on your opponent's active until its remaining HP is 10. So I think at a glance, this seems like a really bad trade-off. You're knocking out your Claydol to not knock out your opponent's active. So that's a little bit annoying. If you're playing something like, what is it, the Paldean Clodsire EX that can automatically poison your opponent's active, at that point, you're now sort of trading pretty evenly, I would say, especially if they're a multi-prize Pokemon. It's actually not that awful to be able to knock out your Claydol to get 2 or 3 prizes in return. So there are like weird situations where this can be good, but knocking yourself out just never feels good. So I could be mistaken, but I don't think we have anything right now that can extend the HP of Claydol. Like, maybe there's something I'm blanking on, but I don't think we have any tools or anything that increase the HP of stage 1 Pokemon right now. I'd have to comb through the card pool and take a second look. But if you can do that, well, then that makes things a little bit more interesting, because then you can actually avoid the KO and just force your opponent to knock you out instead. But again, there could be weird situations where Kaboom Doll could be a somewhat useful attack, but definitely not too excited about this one. Okay, but next we have what looks like a new Vespiquen EX. I think this is our, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the only Pokemon EX that we didn't see get revealed before the set. But yeah, let's take a look at this thing. First attack, Grass does 60 heal, or no, just heal 60 from one of your Pokemon. Okay, that doesn't seem that great. And then 200, put 3 damage counters on each of your opponent's bench Pokemon that has any damage counters on it. So yeah, this thing is a pretty big disappointment, I would say. Yeah, I really am not a big fan of this card. Like, even though it's Psychic type, it still requires Grass Energy And it requires specifically 3 grass energy. Like if one of these had been a colorless, well, at that point, maybe we could have powered this thing up with Mirage Gate, but now if we want to use this, we have to use something like Gardenia's Vigor or like Fortress EX. And then the other issue that we have is we still have to find a way to get damage counters on our opponent's Pokemon to be able to get the spreading effect from this attack. Like, even if this was just spread 3 damage counters without any sort of additional requirement, I think this attack would still be kind of bad. So yeah, guys, I'm just kind of at a loss for how to best power this thing up. Maybe there's, like, feel free to sound off in the comment section. Is there something I'm overlooking that would make this card easier to get set up? Because right now, I just don't really see it. It seems like a lot of hoops to go through or to jump through for very little upside here. So we have another card we already knew about, that is Glamora EX. I actually made a YouTube short about this the other day. But I think this card is okay. Has a good ability, at least if it's in the active spot. Your opponent can only have 3 bench Pokemon. So in theory, if you use the Ascension attack on Glimmet, you can actually get this guy in play immediately, turn 1 going second, and really just pressure your opponent's bench, which does seem pretty good. But its attack is 140 in poison, which is okay. It's fine. It's kind of like an all right 2-shotting number. But guys, I don't think this attack is winning you games. Like, I think it's really hard to build your entire deck around this. I know squeezing your opponent's bench is pretty good, but I think to really make up for the low damage of this attack, you would need to pair this with like maybe other cards like Crushing Hammer, Temple of Sinnoh, etc. I really wish this was on like a single prizer, because this is the type of card where you would love to be able to play Path with it. Like if you could limit their bench to 3, turn off their abilities, and put them at a low hand size with Iono, I think this card would be a little bit better, but you can't actually path them without turning off your own ability, which kind of sucks. Now, if we ever get something like a Floatstone reprint or something that can reduce the retreat cost of Glamora to 0, I actually could see a world where you play just like a 1/1 Glamora in your deck and you just promote it with a Floatstone air balloon style effect in between turns to discard your opponent's bench and then just freely retreat into your attacker for turn. That could be good if we ever get some cards to enable that sort of combo. But yeah, for the moment, the ability is good. The attack is okay, but just like all together, it's still just okay. That's it. It's not good enough, I think, to compete with some of the top decks that we have in the format, unfortunately. Alrighty, next up, guys, we have, of course, the big chase card of the set, Charizard EX. And this card is, for better or worse, actually pretty good too. So its ability here, whenever you play this card from hand to evolve a Pokemon, you can search your deck for 3 basic fire energies and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like. And then its attack for 2 fire energy does 180 plus 30 for each prize card your opponent has taken. So one thing I really like about this card is that it overcomes a lot of the big issues that previous Charizard cards have, where Charizard usually has these like big, shocking, huge damaging attacks that require just like an insufferable amount of energy. But because of this ability, you can actually charge up this current Charizard plus an energy on your next one and get that one ready to go for whenever this one eventually goes down. So if I'm being honest, guys, I don't think it's actually going to be very hard to keep chaining your Charizard EXs turn after turn. But also this attack is pretty nuts. Like 180 is already a solid number to sort of lead the game with. We're already one-shotting Gardevoir EX, we're one-shotting Mew EX, or Mew VMAX, my mistake, guys. But, you know, the later it gets into the game, the heavier hitting this card only gets. So if we just run through the math, if your opponent's taken 5 prize cards, what, we're doing 150, 330 damage with this thing? That's pretty nuts. So I think this card just really trades well with a lot of the stuff we have in format. And the fact that it's weak to grass here and not like water is actually pretty huge too, because grass just doesn't have a lot of really popular Pokemon right now. Like, we just saw Fortress EX come out. That thing hasn't really caught on. We have other decent grass Pokemon like Hisui and Lilligant. There's what, Wo-Chien EX. There's a bunch of grass Pokemon in the format, but they just don't really see play. And if that remains true, I mean, Charizard EX is going to be a Pokemon that can't be one-shot very easily. It can play the 2-shot game with even playing things like Cheryl as well, because you can always, if Charizard gets swung on, you can Cheryl, evolve into your next one, accelerate your energy back into play. Or I guess you could even go like, if you have the Pokemon Go Charizard in play, you could even Cheryl and then just attach 1 energy from hand and be ready to go again. That doesn't seem that bad either. But yeah, of course, as you get later into the game, then you start entering into one-shot territory too. So I've got to say, guys, I think Charizard EX is sick, and it's kind of unfortunate the only like really good card we've seen from this set so far is Charizard, because Charizard's already going to be one of the more expensive cards from Obsidian Flames, just even if nothing was printed on this card outside of its artwork and HP. But because it's probably going to be the big chase card for players as well, I am definitely a little bit anxious to see what prices on this thing are going to look at. So let me know in the comment section, guys, what do you think this card is going to be going for after the set drops? Definitely curious to see, or maybe dreading to see how that's going to be looking. But Charizard EX, like I said, I definitely think is a pretty solid Pokemon. So we do have a Paldean Clodsire. While I don't think this card is like particularly like amazing or anything, it does at least pair kind of nicely with the EX version, because the EX version, I believe it's if you have a stadium in play, it poisons your opponent's active, and this guy does 80 plus 120 if your opponent's active is poisoned. So kind of works out because now you can play like a very thick count of Wooper to more easily guarantee your Clodsire EX in play. And now your main attacker, debatably, can also come from the same evolution line. So that's kind of cool, I guess. You can power it up with Dark Patch, Reversal Energy. So it might be like a fun tier 2, tier 3 deck, but again, probably isn't going to, like, I don't think this card is probably going to win like your next regional or anything. Alrighty guys, so we have Absol EX. This was another card we just saw get revealed like in the past week, and I don't think this card is that great, unfortunately. Future Sight allows you to rearrange the top 3 cards of either player's deck, and the second attack does 100 plus 120 more if your opponent has 3 or fewer cards in hand. So it might sound weird, but honestly, I think this first attack is probably even the best one that we have on Absol, because the second one, you can power it up with Dark Patch, of course. That's not too big of an issue. But your opponent has to have 3 or fewer cards, which means Judge won't work to fulfill this attack. You're going to have to wait till you can I honor your opponent to 3 or play like a Roxanne. Or you have to play cards like Sydney, Spirit Mask, maybe Judge plus the new Snatch Arm that's coming out in the Pokemon Go set. Not Pokemon Go, but the Pokemon 151 set. So you have to really jump through, I think, a lot of hoops to get this damage buff. I think, if anything, like I said, we would probably just be using this for Future Sight and some sort of control archetype. Maybe even the way you could take this card is you strip your opponent of like the playable cards in their hand with cards like Sydney, Snatch Arm, etc. And then you keep manipulating your opponent's top deck to ensure that they can never draw into like a research or something that could bail them out of the hand that they have. I think that is the idea. And only at that point, I think you could go in with Curse Slug. I think otherwise, this attack is not that great. There's just better dark attackers out there. I'm not too stoked on this one, I have to say. So we do have a new Darkrai. I don't think this card is that great, but I will at least give a shout out to Turbo Dark, because you could, in theory, play this card for its second attack, just as 120. I know not a crazy amount of damage, but you do get to move all of that energy from this Pokemon to your bench Pokemon any way that you like. So this could be a way in your Turbo Darkrai deck to take a knockout and preserve your energy in play. Like if you know you're about to get return KO'd, you just move this energy onto something beefier like your Darkrai V-Star to ensure that they can keep that energy in play to keep hitting for large amounts of damage. But outside of that, guys, I don't think this card is very good. Okay, we have another like sort of control style dark Pokemon here. Malamar here has an ability that allows you to look at the top card of your opponent's deck, then look at the top card of your deck. So again, kind of similar energy to the Absol EX that we just looked at. And honestly, I don't really know what we would pair this with. I guess you could use something like Gutsy Pickaxe. Like if you're really worried about accelerating energy with Gutsy Pickaxe, you can use Malamar to, you know, look at the top card of your deck to see if it's a fighting energy. But at that point, you're better off not even playing Malamar and just playing probably just a heavier fighting energy count at that point, or like Switch Cups or something. So yeah, I can't say I'm too stoked on this card, and that definitely seems to be the theme of this set so far, outside of the Charizard. So next up we have Scizor, another card we already did know about, but Scizor actually does have a pretty decent attack here. Does 10 plus 50 more for each of your opponent's Pokemon in play with an ability. So this actually is a slightly better, also slightly worse in some ways, version of the attack on Flapple from Evolving Skies, which has been, I think, mainly only seen play in like the Zoroark Toolbox deck. And this does 10 more base damage, which is definitely good. also hits certain Pokemon for weakness like Chinpow, so that's good, whereas Flapple is taking nothing for weakness. But the big issue I have here is that this attack is an actual metal energy, whereas Flapple is just a colorless energy. And right now, if you were to play this in Zoroark Toolbox instead of Flapple, you would have to play things like actual metal energies or like luminous energy or something like that. And you would have to really drastically, I think, rearrange the way your energy line is built. But for the moment, I think Flapple is probably just better. So we have Mawile, another early reveal from Obsidian Flames. And I think this actually is probably one of the few decent cards we've seen so far outside of Charizard. But whenever we play this from hand onto our bench, we can discard a special energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. So we've seen cards like this over the years. We've seen, I think, Giratina back from, I want to say it was Team Up. I could be wrong on the set, but from the late Sun and Moon era. I think we also had Kartana GX, which was, I think, from any Pokemon, if I remember right. But either way, we've seen these cards be played in the past. They've been successful. So Mawile definitely has that going for it here. And there definitely are certain decks where this could make sense. Like if you're going against Lugia, this could be a way to remove like that V-Guard energy they have to be able to ensure you can take like a one-hit KO. Or you can use this to get rid of gift energy. In theory, that's all fine. But really, what deck right now wants to play this? Temple of Sinnoh already exists, and I think a lot of decks would rather just play Temple of Sinnoh, like Gardevoir EX decks already play Temple. I don't see them cutting that. I think maybe this could be theoretically for a deck that wants the disruption of Temple of Sinnoh, but also is playing special energies themselves. So that makes sense, but I don't know what deck that actually is right now. So this is a card that I would bet money does see play in the long run, but right now I definitely think it's a bit of a question mark for where this card might wind up. All right, so next up we have King Gambit, which is another card we already did know about, but I do think this card is, well, I don't want to say great, but it's definitely a fun Pokemon. I think the jury is still out on how competitive it is, but its attack here says if your opponent's active has 4 or more damage counters on it, it's just automatically knocked out. What's cool is we don't have to do a lot of damage to our opponent to knock them out, but the issue is we do have to jump through some hoops to make this exact 4 damage counter number happen. But luckily, in theory, we do have some ways at making this work. We do have the Revenge Punch tool that we'll get to down in the trainer card section that will force them to take 4 damage counters. So I think that's sort of the obvious combo they're trying to force you to use. But we also have Meowscarada EX, which, you know, you're a stage 2 already. You're already playing rare candy, so I think it could make some sense to slot that into your deck. So with some Meowscarada snipes and some Radiant Alakazam shenanigans, you can manipulate your opponent's damage to take these instant KOs. That seems okay. Now, that being said, though, guys, this is a very combo-oriented card. You're going to need, you know, potentially multiple stage 2s. You're going to be needing the Revenge Punch tool card and hoping your opponent doesn't have a way to remove it either. If I was a betting man, I would say more than likely this is going to be too clunky to actually be like a tier 1 deck, but I imagine this probably will at least be fun to mess around with on like live or something. Okay, so next up we do have another Pokemon EX. We have Revavroom EX. So Revavroom has actually the same ability that we've seen on Honchkrow. You can have 4 Pokemon tool cards attached to it, so that's pretty cool. There's actually, I think, a lot we can do with this ability too. Like, yeah, we can throw 4 choice belts to do 120 more to Pokemon, you know, Pokemon V. But we also have the new, what is it called? I forget. There's a new tool in the Pokemon 151 set that reduces your damage to your stage 1s by 30. And between the minus 30 from those, plus the minus 30 from this attack, you could take, what is that, 150 less damage every single turn when your opponent attacks. That actually seems like kind of crazy. Even though I really do like this ability and the fact that it's on a much tankier Pokemon than Honchkrow, the issue that Revavroom has is that it has a metal energy attack cost because we no longer have Metal Saucer in the format. So to get this thing powered up, we are going to have to use like the Lost Engine, which isn't out of the realm of possibility, or we are going to have to play Magnezone, which is a stage 2. So there's just really not great options for getting this thing up and running. That's my big issue I think I have overall here. There is also the single prize Revavroom, which has yet to really catch on, and since they do come from the same evolution line, this could finally be that card's chance to shine as well. But again, it's just, this attack cost is really just bumming me out. If we can find a way to successfully get around this, I think this card actually could be decent. But until then, I'm on the fence with this one. I really want to love this card, but I'm just not there quite yet. And so at least for our final Pokemon EX, we're going to close things out on, I think, a pretty good note. That's going to be Pidgeot EX. This has probably actually been I think the EX that's actually had the most discussion, to be honest. That's because it's kind of a spiritual successor to the old Pidgeot from Fire Red Leaf Green, which is one of the best cards of all time, if we're being honest. And this has the same exact ability here. So once during your turn, you can search your deck for a card, put it into your hand. So yeah, just any card, no strings attached. The only issue, of course, is that this is on a multi-prize Pokemon, so you can technically get this shut off by Path to the Peak. And it is on a stage 2, so you have to be playing rare candy probably already to make use of this. Other than that, guys, this is a pretty good card. This means that your opponent can't Iono you to 2 and have you brick, because you can then just search your deck for a research or whatever it might be to bail yourself out of that hand. Or just get you, I mean, just really anything you want. You can get that game-winning boss's orders. You can grab like that second cross switcher you might need. Even though Pidgeot from Fire Red Leaf Green was one of the best cards of all time, things are a little bit different for this card. Like I said, Path to the Peak can shut this thing off. So Iono Path actually would be pretty devastating for your deck. But also Rare Candy just functioned differently back then. Back when that card was released, you could actually bench Pidgey and immediately Rare Candy into Pidgeot EX, or Pidgeot back then. We can't do that now, so that does make this card a little bit worse. And back then too, like a lot of the decks were based around Rare Candy. Right now, there's really only a handful. Like we have Gardevoir EX, of course, and probably Chien-Pao. There's not too many other like playable stage 2 decks currently. But I definitely can see a world like as we get further into the Scarlet and Violet era, and once we start to lose the last of the Sword and Shield era cards, this definitely could be better, because I think we naturally will start to see more and more stage 2 EX decks become good over time. So if you are already playing like 4 rare candies in your deck, it makes sense to slot in like a 101 line of Pidgeot. And I think maybe even in the short term, this could be a good partner for Chien-Pao. I think the Pidgeot EX actually could serve sort of a similar role as the Arceus as being this combo enabler. But unlike Arceus, you can actually get repeated use out of this ability, whereas Arceus, you're going to burn it, get your 2 cards, and that sort of be the end of it. Long term, I would be really shocked if this card never saw play. Pidgeot from Fire Red Leaf Green was amazing for this ability. The ability is still the same thing here, only on a multi-prizer, and I don't think that's enough of a difference to deter this card from being played. So Pidgeot, great card, just might be better in the long term. And so for the last Pokemon we're going to give a shout out to, that's going to be Flamigo here, though I'm still not too pumped about this card. But it's attack here to 60, and if you have any Flamigo on your bench, this 60 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So the only reason I'm bringing this up is because in, of course, the United Wings deck, you could, in theory, cut one Flamigo, which seems kind of bad, and play this one instead, because if you're going against some sort of deck that plays like low HP, like 60 HP Pokemon, you could slide in one of these to get like a double KO out of nowhere, so that seems like kind of okay. And the other Flamigo does at least search this one out. But for the moment, I think you should just play 4 of the other Flamigos. Just seems like it's better, but could be a card to at least keep in mind for that deck, maybe at some point. And that does bring us to the end of our Pokemon. Let's take a look at these trainer cards. So up first, we have Letter of Encouragement. You can only play this if any of your Pokemon were knocked out during your opponent's last turn, and you search your deck for up to 3 basic energy cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand. So I think, of course, the big deck that would ever want this is going to be Chien-Pao EX, because you have Irida, so you can search this thing out basically whenever you need it if you're only playing like a 1 copy. But between Chien-Pao's ability and this, you can now guarantee 5 energy for turn, and that's pretty good. I mean, that's probably knocking out whatever is going to be in your path with Chien-Pao. But at that point, this thing does compete a little bit with Superior Energy Retrieval. You know, with that card, you do get more energy, but does come at the cost of getting rid of cards in your hand. So if you are playing 4 retrievals, I could see a world where you're cutting 1 for one of these, like for the turns where, you know, maybe it's early on in the game and your opponent took the first KO of the game. This is better than retrieval at that point. Or maybe you have a hand where you can't really afford to get rid of anything. Like if your opponent Ionos you down to like 2 cards, you might not be able to get rid of those last 2 cards, and this could be better in those situations. But even outside of Chien-Pao, there are still like other weird things that benefit from this. We have Meowscarada EX, of course. There's even like the Swim Freely deck, or like Cherrim decks and stuff like that. So I think this card is actually pretty good. Chien-Pao's by far and away the big deck I think you would want to play this in. I guess Guardy also to a lesser extent too. But yeah, Professor's Letter was a great card. Capacious Bucket was a great card. Even though this is a little bit more limiting than those since something does have to be knocked out, I still think this probably is going to see play in some decks. Probably Chien-Pao if nothing else. So up next, it looks like we have every mill deck's worst nightmare. We have Patrol Cap. As long as the Pokemon this card is attached to is in the active spot, cards in your deck can't be discarded by effects of your opponent's attacks, abilities, item cards, tools, or supporter cards. So if you are sick of Tyranitar milling the top 2 cards of your deck, or if you're sick of like those Misfortune Sisters cards getting rid of your precious items, you could play this. But honestly, guys, I don't think we're carving out space for this card right now. Maybe in the future, if we get a like designated control deck that's playing these styles of effects, we can maybe consider this. But even at that point, they can still just play Lost Vacuum to get rid of this. Not too stoked on this one, but hey, who knows? Maybe one day there will be a use for it. So we have the Revenge Punch tool card. Did mention this throughout the discussion of some other cards here, but whenever the Pokemon it's attached to is knocked out by damage from your opponent's attack, put 4 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. So I think a lot of the time this is actually going to be a direct upgrade over something like Rocky Helmet. And there are a few Pokemon we did look at today which would like this. If you are playing the King Gambit, this does perfectly set up its attack for you. Or you could throw this on like the Revavroom EX we looked at, where, I mean, more than likely they're not knocking out Revavroom, but it would be kind of funny if you could throw down 4 of these on there and force your opponent to take 160 damage. But I think in terms of like real practical application, I think if you're ever going to play this card, it would be for Gardevoir EX. So if we are playing, let's just say like an Arceus deck, where your opponent is probably going to put their Zacian Vs or their baby Gardevoirs within a few damage counters of being KO'd, well, Revenge Punch, if they do take these big KOs on your Arceus or other V-Stars, well, guess what? You can just instantly return KO them with this tool. So this does fill kind of a similar role as, what was it, Panic Mask? But instead of it being a more defensive card, now we are being a little bit more proactive and taking a KO instead of stopping them from attacking. All right, so we have Gita, another card that was revealed, like, I think actually within the past couple days. So this one's still a little bit fresh on my mind, but it says, until the end of the turn you play this card, none of your Pokemon can attack, but you search your deck for 2 basic energies and attach them to one of your Pokemon and shuffle your deck. So it's kind of a cool card, just a nice sort of generic form of energy acceleration. So this could maybe help out decks, maybe like the Revavroom EX deck we were just talking about, where it doesn't have a great form of energy acceleration. Maybe you can use this in the early game to get going, but I think my issue I have with this is that it's a supporter card, guys, and you can't play it on the first turn. So you have, like, if you go first, you're waiting till turn 2 to start using this, and you're not attacking until really turn 3 at that point. I'm not a big fan of this. This makes me think that if we are going to play this, we would probably want to play something like Klefki's or, you know, Diance's to sort of like wall against our opponent while we're setting up our field with this supporter. But the upside to this card is that it is searchable by Lumineon, so we can at least find this on probably turn 2 is the big turn we're going to be using this, and get our field set up. And especially if we are leading with a Diancie or something like that too, your opponent probably won't be able to boss up your Lumineon or whatever you're accelerating your energy to as well. It almost kind of feels like you have to build your engine around this card, and that's what kind of bums me out about it. So we have Ortega, says, look at your opponent's hand, choose a card you find there, put it at the bottom of your deck, then your opponent may draw 1. So this is just, of course, my first impressions, guys. These are largely my knee-jerk reactions. But to me, I look at this card and think, why would I rather just not play Iono? Like, I know in the early game, this is probably more disruptive than something like Iono, but if we're playing this, this means we're not playing a card that draws us cards. We're basically just mildly disrupting our opponent. Like, I know we get to choose the card that's being gotten rid of. So yes, we might be able to get rid of like a draw supporter or something, but I feel like this card's kind of hard to make use of. The only way I can really think that this card is good is if, like, turn 1 of the game, our opponent placed their hand down to like a 1 or 2 hand size, and you know, like, one of those last cards is going to be a research. Well, you could Lumineon for this thing, put that research at the bottom of their deck, and keep them now with like a really terrible hand. But overall, guys, I think I'm Team Ayano. I think I'm Team Judge instead of this thing, since this, like I said, doesn't really do anything to help us get set up. So with Poppy, we move up to 2 energy from one of your Pokemon to another one of your Pokemon. So this kind of like a double energy switch combined, but as a supporter, which doesn't seem that enticing if we're being honest, because that means if we're playing this, we're not playing boss, we're not playing research, Ayano, etc. But I will say the big upside I think this card has going for it, like the big case it's making for itself, is that it doesn't specify basic energy. So in a way, it's actually a little bit better than 2 energy search combined, because now we can actually move special energies with this thing. Though I will say, I don't know how many special energies we actually want to move in the current format, because Lugia is definitely by far and away the big deck that's based around special energies, but you already have like great control over where those energies go with Archeops. I guess if you do play something like regenerative energy in Lugia still for some reason, you could do some plays where you get use out of regenerative energy, move your one copy that you're playing to a different Pokemon. That way you can keep getting that healing effect every time you evolve. So that's something, I guess. The only other play I think I could really see with a card like this is maybe in Gardevoir decks, where let's say you're trying to get like a big one-hit KO with your Shining Arcana Gardevoir. Well, you're capped at only taking 6 energies from discard pile before you can knock yourself out. So you can get your 6 energies, and then if you still need some more, you can accelerate to a different Pokemon and move those energies with Poppy over to your Gardevoir to take one of these big one-hit KOs. But I mean, Reversal Energy already kind of fills that same sort of role. So again, I'm just kind of struggling where this card is going to slot into, and I don't think there is a good answer for that just yet. Alrighty guys, and it looks like our last supporter here is going to be Rhyme. So Rhyme says, draw 3 cards and switch out your opponent's active to the bench. Now, don't get scared just yet. Your opponent chooses the Pokemon to switch. So that doesn't make a big difference. This is not boss's orders plus 3 cards. That would be insane. And it's kind of interesting. Just that small word change takes this card from being like absolutely broken to being debatably maybe not even playable. Like we've seen a lot of these draw 3 plus a bonus effect cards like Avery, Worker, etc. But I think this is actually maybe even the worst of the bunch, because unlike a card like Escape Rope, where yeah, you can force your opponent to switch, and sometimes that might not be good for you. With Escape Rope, you can still boss that Pokemon back up. Whereas with Rhyme, you can't. Like, if this is your only supporter, and you need to knock out your opponent's active for turn, I mean, playing this card kind of screws you up pretty bad in that instance. Now, where this card maybe could be good is where if you're going up against, let's say like a Duraludon VMAX, a Mimikyu, maybe like a Goodra V-Star, like something that's very difficult for your deck to deal with there in the moment, you could use this to force them out of the active spot. And the card is searchable with Lumineon, so you can find it on those exact turns from time to time. I think the only other deck that would consider playing something like this is maybe like a spread deck. But yeah, I think this one is a swing and a miss, as much as I hate to say. I think if we're going to play one of these styles of supporters, I think I'd rather play Avery. I'd rather play Worker. And this thing is definitely at the back of the line right now. But it's not unplayable. I just am not sold that there is a use for it right now that we need to play this card for. And looks like we do have a couple stadiums to round out the set. We have Town Department Store. So this thing lets you search your deck for a Pokemon tool card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. So obviously we want to pair this with our homie Revavroom EX or Honchkrovi or like the Electrode from the 151 set. Definitely makes sense for a deck like that, but I will say there is a pretty big downside built into this card. Specifically, this allows them to get like Forest Sealstone, which is a really huge negative here because, you know, if they're just grabbing Choice Belt or something like that, yeah, that's kind of annoying, but it's not a huge deal. But now, if you are playing against a deck like Lost Box, Mew, even Gardevoir sometimes plays Forest Sealstone, now you're putting a stadium in play that effectively allows your opponent to search their deck for any card and put it into their hand. That's pretty bad. I don't know if the benefit you're getting from this is big enough to justify playing it in one of these decks. And so for the last card, we have Pokemon League HQ, which has definitely had a good bit of people talking because it increases the attack cost of basic Pokemon in play by a colorless energy. So yeah, this is annoying for cards like Miraidon or like United Wings or some of the attackers in Lugia. But the big deck I think people really have their eye on here is going to be Lost Box, because up until this point, Lost Box really hasn't had any good checks against it. Like, we've had cards like Drapion V or Spirit Tomb to help deal with Mew, but Lost Box really has gone unchecked in terms of having counters printed for it. And I think the thought here is you want to play this thing down and go Iono on the same turn, because otherwise I think it is pretty easy for your opponent to bump this card, because they have things like Pokestop, Beach Court, Lost Vacuum. But honestly, even outside of all of those, they can still just use Mirage Gate and just pay the additional energy. But even though I am being a little bit pessimistic, I do think there are a handful of decks that still could want to try this out. Like, I think one of the big ones that comes to mind is just the whole category of decks in general that are like single prize evolution decks that get wrecked by Sableye. But in terms of more like established decks, I think Gardevoir EX is going to be the big one, just because Gardevoir, it damages itself, or all of its attackers, I should say. You know, it's susceptible to cards like Sableye picking off things like Curlias on the bench. But also, I think Gardevoir has the deck space to play this, since the stadiums I think are a little bit flexible. I think you could cut maybe like a Collapsed or maybe your Temple of Sinnoh in place of something like this. And it plays a heavy Iono count, so you definitely can make the big League HQ Iono play happen. I don't think this is like the kryptonite for Lost Box that a lot of people seem to think it might be, just because Lost Box does play so many ways at getting rid of this or just playing around it. But I think this card is good enough to where if you're a deck that is struggling a little bit against Lost Box already, but still has a chance in the matchup, this could be the card that just tips you over the edge of maybe finally having a slightly favored matchup against those decks. But I definitely like this energy though. I'll be happy to see more Lost Box counters as we get deeper into this Scarlet and Violet era, if at all possible. But yeah, I think that's a pretty decent note to end on. Even though I think a lot of this set that we looked at today honestly wasn't that great. Charizard EX is definitely the big chase card for the set. I think a lot of the other cards we looked at today really were pretty underwhelming, I have to say. But I definitely want to hear from you guys down below in the comment section. Are there any cards from this set you're looking forward to? Do you think I'm being too harsh on this set? Let me know your full thoughts down below in the comment section. But with that being said, guys, if you did enjoy today's content, remember to leave a like on the video. Or if you're feeling maybe a little bit extra generous, you can always become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.